Forest Park in Portland, Oregon is a menagerie of towering trees and winding trails. One can wander through here for hours and only see a small portion of all there is to be taken in. The park also has a robust history, in particular the many trees it gave to help Portland's one-time thriving lumber industry. It was also, at one time, a necessary place for some to get through when there were few roads crossing the hills between Portland and west side towns such as Beaverton and Hillsborough. Even after the Great Plank Road was built in the 1850s, it was far to the south of where Forest Park is today. And there was a time when people lived in these woods. And had things gone differently, there might have been many more living out here. And to live somewhere, you often need a road to get there. I've taken a particular interest in abandoned roads around the Portland area. I've put out 2 videos on the subject, the second of which concluded with a little section on Leif Erikson Drive, a primary path cutting through the middle of Forest Park today. But this wide gravel path was originally a road with a specific purpose. And as soon as I finished that video, it got me to thinking about the other possible old roads that had once run through this more than 5,000-acre park. Some I had stumbled onto before, and others were long gone before I came around. There is also a history in here where some small pieces remain, but much has been lost to time and changes in the area as it was transformed into a park in 1948. This is a story about that which is gone, sure, but it is also a story about those years before Forest Park became a reality and the alternate history that might have taken place. July 5th, 1915, marked the opening of Hillside Boulevard, a thoroughfare wrapping along the hillsides, obviously, and trees of the well-logged hills to the northwest of Portland. For the first time, a steady, level road was built through here, providing locals a perspective many hadn't seen before. Beginning at the end of Thurman Street, Hillside Boulevard weaved its way all the way up to Germantown Road. While locals were excited to take in this new route, appeasing local commuters was not the primary motivation behind the construction of this road. Within a couple years, this boulevard would be described as looking abandoned. The work on this stretch would be almost never-ending, with it becoming a public works project in the early 1930s. And during this same time period, Hillside Boulevard would undergo a name change. During the City of Portland's great address renumbering, which also included several street name changes, it was noted that Hillside Boulevard would become Leif Erikson Drive. Despite a name change, the now Leif Erikson Drive would endure ongoing issues in trying to stay open. After briefly opening back up in 1934 to those more fearless drivers in town, the drive would close for nearly 2 decades, not opening up again until July 31st, 1953, when it was opened for a day as an experiment. It was called A Road That No One Knows in the City of the Rose, a road that opens new vistas, a road that penetrates the heart of Portland's forgotten forest. This made sense as Forest Park had officially opened less than 5 years earlier, the grand opening happening on September 25, 1948. In July 1955, the drive would be opened again, for more than just a day. By this time, it was described as a smooth dirt and gravel road that was only wide enough to handle one-way traffic, as numerous portions of the drive had been taken back over by nature. And from this time on, the road would only be open between its start at Thurman Street and Saltzman Road, a route that ran more east and west through the hills there. Commuters could enter at Thurman and exit down Saltzman. From this point, over the next couple years, the drive would be opened, but only for a short period in the fall, providing commuters an up-close view of the seasonal autumnal beauty. Even with it open for only short periods of time, it still would sometimes close early due to muddy conditions or even fire hazards. Work would continue on this stretch into the 1960s, and by 1969 it would be the only road open continuously through the park. And while still open to traffic, little came. It was described as a little, crooked, narrow road with a few park benches put in close by, just to add a little charm. It was the early period of gradual transition that would lead to the closure of the drive to vehicular traffic. By 1980, it was noted the drive was closed to traffic due to fire concerns, but open to foot traffic. The latest reference I found to it being used by vehicles came from a February 1982 newspaper when the drive was described as being open to vehicles despite not being heavily used. In the decades since, it has become one of the most popular walking trails in the city, with a width greater than any other trail in the park and a gradual grade, making the trail more accessible to those walking it on foot. The idea for a park in these often logged hills had its origins back around the turn of the century. With a municipal park commission established in 1899, the city brought in John Charles Olmsted, a landscape architect, to put together a plan for the parks in the city. At the end of 1903, he presented a detailed plan that suggested a parkway that ran through the hills from the Riverview Cemetery up through Maclay Park and beyond to the north. This clearly indicated a motivation to convert much of the hills beyond just City Park, later Washington Park, into parkland. This report also included a detailed outline in what was called the Forest Park section, stating that the investment of a comparatively moderate sum in the acquisition of these romantic wooded hillsides for a park or reservation of wild woodland character would yield ample returns in pleasure to taxpayers and to those dependent on them. Despite this suggestion and great support behind the Olmsted Plan, it would be decades before Forest Park would become a reality. But it would only be a few years after this report came out that the land in these parts would experience a shift in direction. But long before Forest Park, and Leif Erikson Drive for that matter, there existed one of the oldest roads in the area, that being Springville Road. Today, a small portion of this road exists on the east side of the park, beginning near the St. John's Bridge and climbing a short ways into the hills. There's still a collection of homes in this area where the road travels before it ceases to function as a road and becomes a trail through the park, sensibly titled the Old Springville Road. This trail cuts a mainly east and west running route through to the west side of the park, where it resumes its function as an actual road just before intersecting with Skyline Boulevard, which runs against much of the park's west side. Just a short distance south of here, the road resumes and runs through the Bethany neighborhood just north of Beaverton before ultimately ending. But many moons ago, Springville Road cut through Forest Park and was used by whatever modern convenience was available at the time, be it a horse and buggy or an automobile. It was one of Multnomah County's first roads outside of the Portland area and was regarded as a highway in its early years. When I discussed the history of Portland's Great Plank Road, built again in the 1850s, I discussed how several sites along the Willamette River between Linton and Oregon City sought to become the key metropolis along the river. One of these places was Springville, a small settlement at the base of where Springville Road is today. It was originally established through a land claim taken out by a W. Baker, who established a wharf on the river. This made it a potential site for shipping out and bringing in goods. This road, dating back to the 1840s, was one of the early routes that crossed the present-day West Hills, and regarded as a one-time route that pioneers used. It would officially be dedicated in 1868, and obviously even by then it had existed for quite some time. While the Plank Road connected Portland to the west side and gave it a leg up on everyone else, the Springville Road was sometimes used as an alternate route, in particular when the Plank Road became impassable. That said, while the Plank Road had its issues, Springville Road was arguably more treacherous with its steepness. So I checked Saltzman Road. I was like, that's kind of steep, and this is a shorter route, so maybe Springville wouldn't be as bad. It's steeper. I even read in the history, one of this road's issues is how steep it is. Still made this decision. Stuck between steep hills to the west and the river to the east, Springville had little room to expand, and the town site would be vacated in 1908. This happened after a petition to do so was taken out by a Security Savings and Trust Company, claiming that since the site was platted, little effort had been made to maintain or improve on it. The wharfs and warehouses on the river faded in significance, and ultimately the railroad would be built through there as the train became the primary mode of transporting goods. Today, the former site of Springville is known as Whitwood Court. But even Whitwood Court is hardly a new place. In fact, when work was started in 1913 to redo the Springville Road, Whitwood Court had already been around for a couple years. Rebuilt, this road was described as a dirt road that was kept in solid condition. It was considered a more treacherous counterpart to Germantown Road, which ran roughly parallel to it to the north. Efforts would be made over the next several years to keep the road in shape, with a push made in 1925 by the Albina Fuel Company so that they could use it to their advantage. However, when this matter was looked into, it was found that the road had been seriously damaged by the large trucks the fuel company had been driving through there. So instead of engaging in further improvements on Springville Road, they shut the road down to heavy traffic. It was also found that the fuel company had been stashing large quantities of wood in the forest near the road, something that was deemed a serious fire hazard. Despite this downgrading of the road's usage, it almost had the chance at a revival when work was moving in the late 1920s towards constructing a large bridge across the Willamette close by. You've maybe heard of it. Finally built in 1931, the St. John's Bridge is one of the most beautiful and recognizable bridges in the state of Oregon. But in the early planning, Springville Road was considered for inclusion as the approach for the bridge, which isn't all that crazy since the road does begin just north of the west side approach of this bridge. Had this happened, it's a wonder how the history of this historic road might have changed. Perhaps not by much. Granted, Most vehicles crossing the bridge did so ultimately to get to Highway 30. That's cool. Dude. So this is technically as far as traffic can go. So you can get a little ways in here. I noticed they said no parking, like no parking allowed. Once the road became gravel right before it started coming into the park. And oh my God, look at this RV. Sorry to get distracted. Discovery's a forest park. But yeah, a lot of these no parking signs pop up. I think somebody actually might live here. Or at least they're residing here. That's crazy. I mean, this is more crazy, most craziest part of it. But yeah, you see these no parking little sticks all the way up. So I figured, okay, well, some form of traffic must still be allowed up to this point, or else they wouldn't have it like that. And the gate is open down there. So this is as far as you can go before it's cut off to vehicular traffic. You can even see allowed to be on your bike, your horse, or walking your dog. So apparently if I don't have a dog, I'm not allowed. And yeah, so at this point the trail generally, at least according to Google Maps, becomes old Springville Road. And here is the part that one could say is the abandoned portion of the road. And I'm even noticing, like, under this dirt, it's much more firm. Like actual, like, it's almost like it's macadamized is the term. I feel like that doesn't really start, I didn't really start noticing it till I passed this sign, although I may have not been paying attention. Yeah, I feel like you get to here and it's much more just gravel, unless it's underneath. And it's like right kind of here you start noticing that difference, right before you go through here. And see, then it starts, because I noticed it first, out here it sort of sticks out the most. You can see it. And I know work was done on it extensively in 1913, and work was done again in the 1930s. I'm sure obviously other work has been done to upkeep in here, but those are the serious efforts that I know about in terms of maintaining this road back in the days when you could still drive through this portion. we've come to the crossing of two great Forest Park roads. Leif Erikson crossing over Springville. An early 30s project was pursued to widen the road, showing at the time there was still hope for this to be a useful route through the hills. But the close-by Germantown Road was always a more preferable route to take. And, like any other road in this area, Springville Road's popularity was always overshadowed by the often closed Leif Erikson Drive. And like Leif Erikson, it continued to be open to traffic, off and on, into the 1980s. Not a lot is known about Springville Road between the late 30s and the early 80s, aside from probably the memories of those who lived in that immediate area. Even as efforts were made to keep Leif Erikson Drive open starting in the 1950s, oftentimes it was not open as far as Springville Road. With no direct access to the road during this time, it suggests this area where it ran through was in pretty rough shape. An article from July 1982 described Springville Road as a dirt road leading into the park, not clarifying whether one could still drive into the park via this road. By 1986, a published map shows that the portion of Springville Road running through Forest Park was no longer open to traffic, and thus abandoned to become a park trail like most of the rest. As a road abandoned from vehicular traffic, there are portions of the old Springville Road that are wider than other trails running through Forest Park, in particular where it meets the Wildwood Trail, as I discovered back in 2021. Springville Road. Yeah, this was referenced. So my guess is this was probably actually like a road that cars went down once upon a time. So I'm assuming Springville goes this way. I go up that way. It would be, obviously, this is a wide road. This is kind of like Leif Erikson Drive, which this is more Wildwoods speed. At this time, I had no knowledge of Springville Road's background, but based on its size alone, I immediately assumed it was another former road cutting through the park. Lesser known and running south of Springville Road is Saltzman Road, another trail cutting through Forest Park between Highway 30 and Skyline Boulevard. While the road veered off of the highway in an area known as Wilbridge, where a Wilbridge Avenue still exists today, the name for the road comes from a Peter Saltzman, who established a homestead in the 1890s on the west side of where Forest Park exists today. Building a road through the woods and to the other side, down by the Willamette, ended up being to the benefit of many. While Portland's Great Plank Road, aka Canyon Road, and Springville Road are better remembered for providing farmers out west access to the river, Saltzman Road provided the same and was a convenient route for many. Also, like Springville Road, Saltzman continues on to the west of Skyline Boulevard, but only for a short distance. But it today resumes primarily in the Cedar Hills area, running south from Laidlaw Road until it merges with Barnes Road. After a climb from Highway 30, which includes the awesome Fellini's Accidental Circus, something I ironically stumbled onto by accident during my venture, You come to a gate where Saltzman Road transitions to the abandoned Saltzman Road. During my walk through here, I noticed on the way to intersecting with Leif Erikson Drive that a decent amount of Saltzman is paved and noticeably wider than Springville Road. This may sync with the fact that when Leif Erikson was opening off and on during the 50s and 60s, it only ran as far as Saltzman, and Saltzman served as the exit route for those using Leif Erikson. It had a greater purpose than Springville Road as the years passed. Yeah, it's pretty wide, too. It's almost wider than Springville. Well, and it was more frequently used because when they kept trying to open up Leif Erikson in like the 50s and into the 60s, it only ran from Thurman to Saltzman Road. So actually, right up there was the end point. And they would come to this point on Leif Erikson, and they would have to turn off, because it was only one way. They could only run it one way. So they would this was the exit. They would come, turn around, and then go down Saltzman to exit onto Highway 30. So all the traffic entered Leif Erikson at Thurman, and then exited at Saltzman right up there. This rough and rugged country road would have its first fix-up work done in 1896, making it a slightly more accessible road. By the 1920s, it was described as being a mixed combination of a dusty dirt road with certain portions that had been planked. Saltzman Road also has a historic reputation for its connection with tragedies. One odd story from 1932 had a man walking the road discover a note on a piece of cardboard saying a man was dying in a cabin nearby. When the man, Henry Staley, went to the police, they searched the area and found no cabin. On September 2nd, 1968, a faulty stove in the home of Karen Thane set off a fire that killed Karen and her 4 children. It was one of the worst tragedies by fire in the history of Portland at the time. And in more recent years, the 3 victims of serial killer Todd Allen Reed were discarded in the vicinity of Saltzman Road. One woman who lived on the road tragically reported that many women over the years had come to her door seeking asylum from men who took them up into the park to attack them. The area where Saltzman Road starts from on the east side of the park would become known as, again, Willbridge, much like how Springville Road starts in the Whitwood Court area. These 2 names go back more than a century and are tied into a time when the future of Forest Park had drifted in a completely different direction. 2 years before opening, the previously mentioned Hillside Boulevard project would be announced in the summer of 1913. It was going to be a major project with a major motive: to provide direct access into these hills for possible housing developments. Remember, back during this time, these hills had been considerably logged, which left them looking not as great as they do now, but it did come with a benefit. Great open views down on the Willamette River, to the east side of town, and ultimately the mountains in the distance, including the likes of Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens. But these plans hardly started with the construction of Hillside Boulevard. Years earlier, the Willamette Heights neighborhood would come into development in the hills above the site of the 1905 Lewis and Clark Exposition, a neighborhood with beautiful views from above Maclay Park and along the edge of what would later become Forest Park. Developers were seeing dollar signs with all of this undeveloped land in the hills next to Willamette Heights. While this sparked interest in further developments, they would hardly be the first developments in the area. The Mountain View Park location, towards the southwest end of today's Forest Park, was introduced way back in July 1882 as a planned site for summer homes just over the hill from the city. A place not too far away, but a place that felt like it was far away. It was established primarily on the land of the Cornell family, who Cornell Road was named after. With most of this land in Forest Park today, there still are a small collection of homes in the area, mainly along 53rd Drive. Along this road, a short distance north of Cornell, there is a gravel turnoff that is today known as Holman Lane. A short distance in, there is a gate marking the end for vehicular traffic along that stretch. From there, the Holman Lane path goes down the hill to the other side of the park where it comes out at the heart of the Willamette Heights neighborhood. I walked this route in the late winter of 2018, and it's pretty steep if you're traveling west. Granted, not as steep as Springville Road. While called Holman Lane today, the more western portion of this route that branched off 53rd was formerly known as Mountain View Park Road, allowing deeper access into the area where, no doubt, homes were built or at least planned to be built. Alas, this former dead-end road is best remembered for one dark event that still haunts Portlanders to this day. By the end of the 1950s, this now desolate stretch of road had become a lover's lane, much to the displeasure of local residents. For the Thanksgiving weekend, 1960, college couple Larry Payton and Beverly Allen got together. On the evening of November 26th, they drove out to Mountain View Park Road for some private time. The following morning, a patrolling officer found the car right there. Larry was inside, stabbed to death. Beverly was nowhere to be found. Her body would later be recovered along the Sunset Highway, about 40 miles west of Portland. While a couple men would be convicted of this crime years later, nobody seriously believed they were responsible, and they would both be released not long after going away to prison. To this day, this double murder remains one of Portland's most enduring mysteries. To the south end of Forest Park, the Mountain View Park neighborhood was only a precursor to something much greater. With the Willamette Heights neighborhood having greater success years later, along with other developments in the hills, such as Westover Terrace and King Heights, potential developers knew there could be gold in these hills. Furthermore, Portland would see their population more than double in only 5 years between 1905 and 1910. The city was booming, lots of new arrivals needing places to live. The City of Roses was rapidly becoming the place to be, and here was all of this undeveloped hillside property with charming views to match. It was inevitable that someone would take the jump at this possible moneymaker. But, as is so often the case, when the opportunity seemed too good to be true, many jumped at that opportunity. At least 13 different developments would be established in the Forest Park area over a 6-year period, and all of them came into being before construction work began on Hillside Boulevard. Most of these developments would happen towards the north end of the park, just north of Springville Road, where they could be developed between that road, Germantown Road, Skyline Boulevard, and Highway 30. A streetcar line down by the highway and the river would also begin running in 1908, giving potential residents, in the infancy of the automobile, a direct route into the city via streetcar. The potential was just too great, and so this mostly vacant, wooded area was abruptly transformed into a cramped collection of subdivisions. Alright, so I need my little idiot's guide to developments that failed in Forest Park. So behind me is the intersection of Springville Road and Leif Erikson. Leif Erikson is the one that's cutting across here. I'm standing on where Springville Road continues from right over the ridge there. Now, in particular, north of here, there were a bunch of little developments that started happening. It was really the epicenter was north of here. You had Whitwood Court, which is essentially where the town of Springville was, where Springville Road starts, the portion you could still drive on, the portion that's paved, and just the north side of Springville and that side of Leif Erikson. So this full area right off in this direction, that was going to be the Maybrook development. And then Glen Harbor would have been just north of that. So that would have been all to the northeast portion of this. And then on this side of Leif Erikson where I am, this area direct to like my immediate right and then continuing on this direction up the road, that would have been a development that was known as Marine Park. Now, I didn't really find a lot of information about Marine Park. I didn't find a lot of information about a lot of these developments other than the advertisements and all of the excitement that they were going to turn this into just a mecca of homes, and none of it, quite happened. But even compared to the little information available on other ones, Marine Park in particular, there wasn't really a whole lot. And if you continue on this way up Springville Road, I noticed in maps, there was a location called Hillhurst. And just a little further north of Marine Park, there would have been Willalaton Park. And then between Willalaton Park and Hillhurst, there was an area called Tullamet Acres. And then there was Glen Harbor Heights, Waldenmere, and this is all leading up to Germantown Road, which is a ways north of here, not horrendously far, but a little ways north of here. So, and then, south of here, there would have been a development known as Ridgewood, this side of Leif Erikson and south of Springville Road. And then on the other side of Leif Erikson, south of Springville Road, a little ways down, there was one called Fairmount. There would have been look at this. And I'm right here. It shows you just like someone got an idea, few people, and then just everybody wanted a piece. Yes, the potential was great. So great that developers were likely looking at the whole thing through rose-tinted glasses. The earliest of these had its foundation in a 650-acre land purchase by the real estate firm of Russell and Blythe, headed by a Percy Blythe. A portion of this land, located just north of Mountain View Park, would become known as Blythe Wood, or Blythe's Woods. According to old maps leading up into the 1950s, there was a distinct road that ran from 53rd Avenue near its intersection with Thompson Road, known as Blythe Road. It ran up into the hills and, one time, connected with Leif Erikson Drive. Looking over maps today, there is no indication that this road still exists, even as a trail. However, there is a forest lane that branches off of 53rd and ultimately becomes a fire lane within the park. While the fire lane portion hooks further north than where Blythe Road would have gone, the forest lane portion starts very close to where Blythe Road once began, making it possible that the two routes at that point are one and the same. The first of the many developments to the north end of the park was the aforementioned Whitwood Court, a 200-acre tract established in April 1907, just a month after Russell and Blythe purchased their land. A Hillhurst tract to the west and just north of Springville Road would start being referenced in 1907 as well, but would never be promoted in the same way that these other subdivisions would be. All I found on this location was a collection of lot sales that happened over a few years into the 1910s. 1908 saw the establishment of Glen Harbor, north of Whitwood Court, a 232-acre tract. Like most others would, they boasted of their great views across the river. The land due west of this site would be established as Glen Harbor Heights in 1910. This site would remain more heavily promoted than others, as it would continue to be promoted on into the mid-1920s. This was a late-in-the-game effort to spark development up in the hills. In April 1909, directly north of Glen Harbor, the subdivision of Waldemere was established, in the vicinity of where Leif Erikson Drive and Germantown Road meet today. While some residential developments happened here, the area would make an industrial shift starting in 1915. Months later, in late 1909, the Maybrook subdivision would be established in between Glen Harbor and Whitwood Court. As makes sense, much of these early developments were in the hills just above Highway 30 and the Willamette River, as opposed to further inland and up in the hills where the elevations may have been higher, but views of the lands beyond were not quite as open. These developments were also just above the streetcar line that many locals would rely upon to get around. The summer of 1910 would bring the Willalaton Park subdivision, just west of Glen Harbor and Maybrook. This area would see considerable success early on, with numerous lot sales, including a lot to establish a new St. Helens Hall, a project that would ultimately fall through. Late 1910 would see a shift in the establishment of these many new subdivisions, almost all of which existed between Springville and Germantown roads. But in November 1910, the Regent Heights subdivision would be established just west of Highway 30 and quite a ways south of these others. At just 55 acres, it was smaller than the rest, but still large enough that it was broken into 300 lots. The next subdivision would be Wilbridge in the spring of 1911. Located again where Saltzman Road begins, this establishment also existed down by Highway 30 between Whitwood Court and Regent Heights. A small school would be established there in 1915. North of there, but south of Springville Road, The Ridgewood subdivision would be established in December of 1912. Like some others, there's not a whole lot of information out there about Ridgewood, except where it was located. Another establishment with little information to go on other than advertisements for lot sales was called Tulamit Acres, first referenced in the spring of 1913. It was wedged between the Hillhurst track and Wollalaton Park. It made sense that two of these might be next to each other, as Wollalaton and Tulamit were both clearly reversed combinations of Willamette and Tualatin. These were the Tualatin Mountains they were located in after all, and a key viewpoint was the Willamette River down below. Other developments were so obscure that I could never find an establishment date for them, and wonder how far along they actually got as subdivisions in their own right. Specifically two that were known as Marine Park and Fairmount. So here's a moment where I chose to cut in. Hey, you're getting Steve hasn't had a shower in about 28 hours because he's trying to get his video done. I'm also shooting this on my GoPro because I left my cell phone at work yesterday and I have to wait till my wife brings it home tonight. I am a wreck. Now, whenever I do a video, there's so much, especially one like this where there's so much information, there's so many places to remember, you're going to stumble at some point and you kind of have to pause and check on stuff. So, the reason I was not finding, and I'm glad I figured this out while I was editing. The reason I was not finding information about one particular place that I was calling Marine Park is because it was called Marine View. And for some reason, while I was trying to keep all these different names in my head, I started thinking Marine View was Marine Park. So I started looking up a marine park in this area and didn't find anything, obviously. Marine Park was wedged between Wollalaton Park and Springville Road, while Fairmount was down by Highway 30 between Whitwood Court and Wilbridge. Many, many developments over just a couple of years, all with the hopes of transforming these hillsides into future editions of what Willamette Heights had become. And as these developments were piling up in the area north of Springville Road, much of the land down by Highway 30 had also been filled in. But a little higher up in the hills, there was still an extensive amount of land between Willamette Heights and Springville Road that had yet to be taken over by the next intrigued developer. And with some 13 subdivisions established by 1913, here came a plan by the town of Linton, just north of these blossoming developments, to run a steady and wide road through the hills running north and south. It would begin at the north end of Willamette Heights and run to Germantown Road, right next to their town. It would be called Hillside Boulevard. So Leif Erikson Drive was to be essentially the peak, the mecca of all of these planned developments out here. All these people thought they were going to make a lot of money really fast by selling off this land, which it wasn't this overcrowded by trees. You actually had views to the east. But if you only have a general idea of the history of all of this, a lot of people might think the whole development craze started and stopped with Leif Erikson Drive, or Hillside Boulevard as it originally was. But the reality was this whole development craze had started a few years earlier. This was just going to be the peak of the whole thing, because there was already a lot going on north of here. But that was the thing. A lot of these early developments were, there was a couple down by where Highway 30 is, down at the base of the park, but most of them were to the north side of Springville Road, and there's a lot of space between Springville Road and Willamette Heights way off in this direction, which is where Hillside Drive, I always want to call it Hillside Drive, Hillside Boulevard started, branching off of Thurman Street. So there was a lot of land between the two that was just about the same as the land over there. So it was thought by running this boulevard all through here that it opened up the possibility of so many more developments between Willamette Heights and those that were developing, again, primarily north of Springville Road. So if what was going on up there was a developmental craze, this boulevard was opening things up to be a developmental craze on crack. And as you can see, that didn't quite pan out. While opening up the possibility for future developments, Hillside Boulevard would also provide a main route cutting through these previously established subdivisions, some of which were barely accessible. And even the ones that were only accessible via the steep and rough Springville Road. Development didn't need another old pioneer road in the area. They needed a charming boulevard. And while Hillside Boulevard was thought to be the great peak of what was possible up in these hills, it would ultimately serve as a powerful representation of what ultimately went so wrong. Remember what I said about seeing things through rose-tinted glasses? These developers were so busy looking ahead at the real estate killing they were going to make that it likely never occurred to them that this land was not stable enough to build upon, much less building endless homes upon. Years upon years of logging done in the park area made it less stable, but at its core, the land in general was not stable enough to build on. This harsh reality was made clear in the construction of Hillside Boulevard, which was met with excitement and anticipation for what it might lead to upon its opening in July 1915. And, to a degree, it would meet the requests of the Olmsted Plan in terms of a parkway leading through the hills. However, that was obviously outlined with the objective of these hills being park space. This boulevard was the brainchild of two real estate men, J.B. Holbrook and Richard Shepard, who saw it as possibly becoming the most charming drive in the Portland area. They also owned land in the Willbridge and Whitwood Court subdivisions, so there was an added motivation there. But almost as quickly as the new boulevard opened, the problems started. Remember, this was a project carried out by the town of Linton, and in 1915 the city of Portland would annex that very town, and therefore they also annexed, so to speak, the cost of this new slice of heaven. And while the route was originally projected to cost around $87,000, it would ultimately end up costing nearly double that at $158,000, or over $5 million today. And all of that money suddenly became a Portland problem. It was such an issue that the city attorney, Walter LaRoche, actively sought anything in the annexation of Linton that could be used to undo it. But that obviously didn't work out. And instead of accepting this unplanned problem for the unfortunate situation it was, the city turned the problem over to the property owners along the new drive. The contractor of the project, Fritz Strobel, who was frustrated as he waited to be paid for the work done, said these property owners had signed waivers to the effect that they were not opposed to having assessments made against them. But that was when this was a Linton project, at a considerably lesser projected cost, with the projection that extensive housing developments were right around the corner. In January 1916, the Portland City Council decided the owners should cover $134,000 of the total $158,000, most of it. And here were owners who granted were opportunists looking to make a quick buck. I'm not shedding any tears for them, but they'd already invested in their properties that they were never going to profit on in the way they'd hoped. They were angry and they fought back, calling the whole thing a real estate scheme that left them with a road that was of little benefit to them. You remember that whole unstable land thing I was talking about before? A key element of this was landslides, as you'd probably presume. After being opened less than a month, even after being fixed up, an August 1915 test drive of Hillside Boulevard revealed a narrow and dangerous road with several large rocks deposited on it from recent slides. Even if the owners were in a place to immediately begin building homes, they didn't have a safe and reliable road to get there. The slides would never cease to be an issue, closing the road several times, and even by 1921, the road was described as looking abandoned. With ongoing lawsuits from the property owners, including an effort on their part to accept a portion of the costs if the city accepted the costs of improving and macadamizing the road. By 1918, a court would lower the amount the owners needed to pay to $81,000. But just because the amount owed was lessened didn't put money in the pockets of these owners. The problem is, these people had already invested a bunch of money just obtaining the properties around here that they were going to finally see profits and money once they developed. And then when they realized this land was no good to develop on, now suddenly you can't make any money off of that. So how were these people going to cover these costs? Because it ended up being about $158,000 for everything, and the city decided to dump $134,000 of that on the people. And through fighting in various lawsuits, that number was decreased closer to about $80,000. I think it was $81,000. And even over a decade after this decision was made, only a small portion of that money that was owed had been paid, because these people, what were they going to pay with? They'd already been, the land deal didn't work out. They couldn't develop. They didn't really have any money. So pretty much all these people lost their land because they couldn't afford to keep that either. So the city ended up foreclosing on a lot of these properties. So a lot of the land out here before Forest Park came along was already city owned, city and county owned. Yes, some houses would be built in these hills, but the massive subdivisions were never to be, nor was the success of Hillside Boulevard, or ultimately Leif Erikson Drive. But through that failure, Forest Park was born. One of the most interesting elements of these subdivisions that were never to be are the roads that were built in preparation for what was projected to come. Numerous short roads peppered this area, at least a few dozen of them, and today they're all gone. What's interesting to me, on first glance, is that we see several roads built to the several blocks south of Springville Road, this mainly being where the Ridgewood and Fairmount developments would have been. Again, two developments of which there is the least amount of information available on. And yet they built roads with names such as Colorado, Grandview, Vista, Norwood, Ridge, Marcia, and Summit. We can also see in the Whitwood Court area around Springville Road that this area was planned to have many more roads than it has today. On these maps, we can also see a collection of roads named after mountains, some of which may have been visible from those locations. North of the Whitwood Court area, we can see a Maybrook Street that would have been in the Maybrook subdivision, and a Willalaton Road that would have cut through the Willalaton Park subdivision. A short gated-off portion of this road still exists just off Skyline Boulevard, becoming a trail called Waterline Road once in Forest Park. And by chance, during my Wildwood Trail exploration, I actually caught a brief view of where Waterline Road comes out. Just south of Wollalaton Park Road, we see there was a college drive that ran almost parallel to it. A small portion of this road also still exists just off of Skyline. And to the south, in the vicinity of the one-time Regent Heights, we see once there were several roads that are no longer there near the start of Leif Erikson Drive at Thurman Street. So many roads, abandoned before they could become much of anything. And now they're all gone. Now all these little tiny roads, they were obviously built to, connect all of these little properties together. And I think of like Sun River. If you've ever looked at a map of Sun River out in Central Oregon, and it's a development for people to go and stay. And there's all these tiny little roads kind of wrapping around so that you can have these individual houses and they each kind of get their own little cul-de-sac of sorts. If they're on the map, my guess is at least some of these roads were made based on where they were and the time they would have been made. They were probably just dirt. I doubt any of them were even really graveled, and even if they had been dirt and or gravel, it would have been really easy for them in that regard, as these developments didn't really quite pan out. It would have been really easy for these little tiny roads to just be completely reclaimed by nature if they were pretty much just little dirt paths in the first place. So with these developments being super unsuccessful, and even by the late 20s, that whole venture was completely gone and a lot of people were losing their property out here. Even with these roads showing up on maps into the 1950s, my guess is these roads were probably not accessible. But if they were made as these maps, sorry, I saw a huge beetle. As these maps suggest they were, if you were, willing to go off into the brush, because I don't think a lot of trails, I know like the Wildwood Trail and Leif Erikson do cut through there, but if you went off the trail and, dug into the ground a little bit, I wonder if you could find certain areas amidst all the, hills and whatnot, where maybe the ground is a little more level and looks a little more graded. And for all we know, you may be walking on one of these tiny little roads that was made once upon a time. But because initially I saw this, I'm like, oh my god, how could there be just no evidence of this existing anymore? And then I thought, well, these were probably, again, mostly just dirt roads, so you could make it. Like Leif Erikson Drive here, if everyone just said, screw it, we don't care about this, we're just going to let this go, we're just, we're not going to maintain it anymore, with time, the earth would start coming up from below, it would start growing in from the sides, and before you know it, there would be no signs that this road was here anymore, because it would just be reclaimed by nature. So it would have been very easy. I mean, if it could happen on Leif Erikson here, it would have been real easy for it to happen. These tiny little roads that were built for these developments that didn't happen, and it was only a few years before people were became pretty clear that this was not going to be a successful venture. So yeah, those roads, I figure they're just one with the earth again. Even with the establishment of Forest Park in 1948, during those early years, at least according to maps, many of these streets still existed, although to what extent it's hard to say. But with all of the roads that were lost, we gained trails that have allowed people to experience Forest Park in ways previously unavailable, much like the prospects of Leif Erikson Drive when it was originally built. And the likes of Leif Erikson, Springville, and Saltzman, while still open to vehicles, they served as the last obstruction keeping Forest Park from being completely what it was set out to be. a complete park space just for those out on a walk or a bike ride, or even for the wildlife to just have a little more peace.